Good afternoon, everyone. So this is just an example of how the Transfrontier Park has assisted, or Transfrontier work has assisted us in implementing a particular project. So I'll just give you a little bit of a background how the project started, and then we'll get into the Transfrontier side of things and the actual processes and the structures. So between about 2000 and 2005, we spent a few years surveying the Drakensberg escarpment for bearded vulture nest sites. It's a critically endangered species which occurs in the Drakensberg Park, but yet we didn't have an idea of how many nests we had or how many birds we had. So the initial results showed a decline in numbers over the 30-year period where surveys hadn't been done. So this was of great concern to us, so we decided to convene a workshop with a number of experts in 2006, and it was basically an exercise to do a population and habitat viability analysis. And essentially what this does, it takes the best data you have on the species and tries to model what's going to happen to the population in the future. So the result, again, was quite depressing. Basically, there was an extinction risk for the species within the next 100 years. And unless you did something immediately and try and look at addressing mortality to the birds. So this was with the information we had at the time. So the idea was to get a lot more information just to try and refine the work that we'd done. And also we realized obviously we need to develop a conservation plan to set up a whole lot of actions to try and combat the decline in the population. So the plan was developed as part of this workshop process, and a task force was established to implement the plan. This task force was called the Bearded Vulture Task Force, and I'll go into more detail about that later. But the plan was then implemented in 2006. We just called it a conservation plan for the species. And in 2011, we decided to reformulate this plan into a biodiversity management plan for the species. So the South African legislation, NEMBA, the Act number 10 of 2004, basically makes allowances for us to develop species-specific management plans. And we thought for this critically endangered species, it's a small population, it's isolated, numbers are declining. We thought the best way to go about it was develop a plan that's basically embedded in legislation, and hopefully that will hold people accountable for actually getting their actions done. We didn't want a plan to sit on the shelf like all the other plans do and not get implemented. The species needed critical attention, and we thought this was the way to go. So the plan took a couple of years to get gazetted. It was gazetted in 2014, and 2016, KZN Wildlife was appointed as the implementing agent for the plan. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail later as well. So the task force was mainly established through the Drakensberg Transfrontier program. Basically, we used the program in 2006 to get together all the role players in the different provinces of South Africa that were affected, as well as Lesotho and other stakeholders. Because the Transfrontier program was in place and had all the connections, it was the best mechanism to use to get that group of people together for the initial workshop. And through that, essentially, the task force then was part of this Transfrontier program. The plan was then basically developed through the collaboration between South Africa and Lesotho with both counterparts. So even though the plan is only a legislative entity in South Africa, the Lesotho government are also basically implementing it, even though their legislation doesn't make provision for it. So essentially the Transfrontier process made provision for the communication between the provinces of South Africa, the Free State, Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal provinces, and then the Kingdom of Lesotho. And essentially the original plan was developed in 2006 as part of this Transfrontier program, and we've been going for over 10 years as a task force, which is, I think, an achievement in itself as well. It's basically been mentioned as one of the most active task forces. The structure of the task force itself sits under the Endangered Wildlife Trust. So it's an NGO, it's a neutral body, and it does oversee basically South Africa and Lesotho, so it doesn't sit under any particular entity. That's how it happened at the time. There's been some debate of whether it should be under the Transfrontier program or not, but the area that we deal with is a lot bigger than the program. So at the time, EWT was the best place to put it, and it sits within the Birds of Prey program of the Endangered Wildlife Trust. So the composition of the task force, basically it has the individuals from the Ministry of Tourism, Environment and Culture from Lesotho, the representatives sit on it, and national government, provincial government and environmental bodies, conservation bodies as well as NGOs. Individuals from the scientific community, from the Fitzpatrick Institute in Cape Town, as well as the Durban Museum, with those that have experience of working with the species or in the area. Representation from the rehabilitation sector and the captive breeding sector. Obviously, Endangered Wildlife Trust is represented, and more recently, BirdLife South Africa is represented, and then the Mluti-Drakensberg Transfrontier Program have representatives on that as well. So the goal of the task force is to ensure collaboration between Lesotho and South Africa in implementing the biodiversity management plan for the species. The plan itself provides a mechanism to ensure the long-term survival of the species by essentially achieving all the actions and objectives and goals within that plan. The implementation of the plan, unfortunately, it cannot rest with an NGO. It has to rest with a government entity, and that's why Endangered Wildlife Trust couldn't be the implementers of the plan, even though the task force are the actual individuals or the body that will be implementing the plan. But KZN Wildlife will oversee and facilitate the implementation of that plan. And essentially, I'm the representative that is responsible for that, and basically run the task force, arrange the meetings, which we have 2 meetings a year, and we're required to do an annual report for deer, and there'll be a 5-year review process for the plan. So just very briefly in terms of progress on the plan, our first annual report was due the beginning of this year, just because it's taken a while, and I'll go into that to get everything in place and try and work out the structures and the functioning of the whole process. But yeah, so over the last few years, we have very few actions that are actually on schedule. We have many actions that are ongoing, that they're not defined over a specific time period. They are ongoing actions. There's a few actions that are slightly behind. There's quite a lot that are significantly behind, and then there's some actions which didn't have a specific time frame, which is the end one over there. So that's just in terms of overall progress. Again, in terms of the 2 or 3 year process, quite a few actions have been removed because of the length of time it took to get the plan gazetted. Some of the actions were actually already achieved, and those that were no longer relevant for whatever reason, those have been removed. There's a number that have been achieved already and are ongoing, some of them. Achieved and completed is about 15% of the actions. Achieved or partially achieved, and there is significant progress, so even though they're not completed, there is some progress. There's quite a lot that are partially achieved, but still a lot of work to be done. And again, 15% of them haven't been achieved, but actions or progress has started. And what's a little bit concerning is 10% of the actions haven't been started at all and haven't been achieved. And I'll go into that a little bit more just now. So what are the actual achievements of the task force and essentially through the biodiversity management plan? Because of the Transfrontier program, the profile of the species has been raised between the 2 countries. The program considered it a flagship species, basically an iconic species for the program. Being a bird, it doesn't know any boundaries, so the range covers both countries, and that's why it was felt it was a really good species to have as an icon or a flagship for the Transfrontier program. And obviously it's quite an attractive bird, but I'm not biased or anything. So one of the other big achievements has been the investigation into the decline of the species. I mentioned we didn't have a lot of information when we started, so we've spent the last 10 years or so basically getting the best up-to-date information on the population status, identifying what threats there are to the species, and essentially this information has all led to the population or the species being uplisted to critically endangered. And we've identified areas of conservation importance through this work. So that is the graph showing the population growth, which, as you can see, is not looking very good at all, and that's over the next 50 years. So the Biodiversity Management Plan, obviously the development of the plan is one of the big achievements of the task force, and the information exchange between individuals and between stakeholders, between agencies, organizations. There's been obviously a lot of sharing of data, sharing of information, and that collaboration has worked really well. Education and awareness has been a very big factor, something that most conservationists don't do very well, and there's a desperate need for education and awareness, and there's been a lot done at school level and as well as community level in both countries. In terms of stakeholder engagement and all the various partners we deal with, as you can see, there's quite a group of people that have been involved. And through the development of the plan, one of the processes is stakeholder involvement, and it includes going to organizations like the Traditional Healers Association, the ESCOM, for example, so big companies, farmers associations, not that any of those are listed here, but those are the people we need to interact with, because it is things like power lines that are killing the birds, poison that is being put out for wildlife by farmers. So we need to interact with all those groups as well. A lot of tracking has been done of the birds over the last few years, and through this information, and basically the red spots are the hot spots of areas where we do need to focus all our conservation action. So that's taken a lot of work and a lot of money to find out where the birds forage and where they breed, so that we at least know where to put the few resources that we have. Training has also been a big part of the program, and again the Transfrontier program makes this possible across the borders through the networks that have been set up. Training on how to deal with poisoning cases and power line collisions, and with the various stakeholders as well. Conservation breeding is something that was started about 2 years ago. Realizing the population is small and isolated, we don't have any birds in captivity, so we started a conservation breeding program by taking the second eggs from the nests, which are essentially biologically redundant, and starting a captive breeding program at the Birds of Prey Sanctuary just outside Pietermaritzburg. So far we've got 4 youngsters over the last 2 years, and obviously hoping to grow that to a decent-sized population which we can keep as a captive stock, and then also consider reintroductions into the future. And this has been quite critical to have that collaboration between the two countries, because moving birds across borders and genetic material is quite onerous. So that brings me to the challenges. The approval process, just to try and find our way, our plan was one of the first plans to be approved, so to understand how the process works, what approvals are needed, what reporting is needed, that took some time and a couple of years to get done. The plan is gazetted in South Africa, but as I say, it's not in Lesotho, so we're relying on the goodwill of individuals for their involvement, essentially. And at the moment, it's a lot about individuals rather than institutions. So that's something we still need to work on, is institutionalize this plan, because it is gazetted and a legal document. It should be easy enough to do, but at the moment, we're relying on individuals to participate and achieve the actions. There's a lot of resource discrepancies, not only between the two countries, but between the provinces. Funding obviously is always an issue. Number of people, just the capacity of the people, transport just to get to meetings, for example, equipment to do the work, to do monitoring, but just simple things like binoculars, not everyone's got the right equipment. So quite a lot of work has been done to try and resource people to actually achieve the actions in the plan. And legislative differences with the species, both countries at least have the species identified as a priority species. But in terms of other policies, there may be differences. For example, I use CITES, where South Africa is a signatory or part of CITES, so is Lesotho, but they've been, banned from CITES for not adhering to all the right requirements, and that's obviously made it incredibly difficult for us to collect eggs from Lesotho and bring them across the border. So all of that slows down the process. You're dealing with a critically endangered species. You need things to happen quite quickly to try and stop the decline. So those are the kind of hindrances that can take many months through government bureaucracy and things like that. But the strengths going forward is the collaboration, is the main strength, and the national involvement and support from DEA has been quite critical just to guide the process and assist us with the implementation. And we always rely on individual enthusiasm to get the work done, because that's the only way it happens. And hopefully the achievements that the group has had over the years will just lead to renewed vigour to actually get more work done. And hopefully with continued and continental collaboration with various management plans and structures that are in place, the actions will hopefully get achieved through the plan. Okay, that's it.